It's the Facebook phenomenon. It's this social media hype that seems to engage all of us. Now, some of us choose to opt out, but that doesn't mean we're not affected by it. Because regularly around us, people use words like, hey, I'll Facebook you, or I tagged you, or I'll post on your wall. We all can't escape this social media craze that we find ourselves in, and there's a lot of conversation that's taking place as to whether or not this is good or it's bad. Does it create a sense of virtual friendship that doesn't really exist? Does it somehow nurture past friendships that maybe are better left dead? Or does it increase our ability to connect and be involved in one another's lives? But beyond thinking in terms of whether it's good or bad, I think we need to ask the question, why? Why is right now social media such an issue in our lives? I think getting to the root causes of this probably is more important than anything else. We live in an age where it's so easily to connect, whether we connect through virtual relationships like Facebook or Twitter, or we're texting or phone calling, and yet if we're honest with ourselves, we're in one of the most deeply disconnected times in all of history. And I think it's out of that sense of loneliness. I think it's out of that sense of not being able to share in deep relational intimacy with others that this yearning emerges for us to explore new ways and new avenues to be able to connect with others. I think prior to asking whether or not it's a good or bad thing, we've got to understand that we are wired for connectivity. We are wired to live together, to share together, to operate in community. We're wired for these relationships that right now are working themselves out online, but we will find any other ways, a myriad of ways of finding ways to be with one another, because we know somehow, some way that innately we were not created to be lonely or to live alone, but to share life with one another. When we trace the contours of creation, we find Israel offering its explanation of our wiring. I've noticed that when a lot of people read the scriptures, or they start thinking about Christianity, or they think in terms of faith in Jesus, we have this tendency to immediately jump into moral categories, good and bad. So when you explain the creation story, what you find is people oftentimes talk about how prior to Eve's sin and Adam's sin that we were inherently good. After that sin, we become bad. And that the sum total of all that we give ourselves to in this Christian life is that someday, somehow, some way, we would be considered good once again. My question, though, is, what happens if instead of thinking in terms of moral categories, we begin to think in terms of relational categories? What if instead of words like good and bad, we start thinking in terms of words like peace and conflict, harmony and brokenness, peace and violence? When we begin to think in terms like that, I think it begins to change the very dynamics of how we understand this relationship and the ways in which we're wired. So check this out. As Israel begins its renderings of the beginnings, as it begins to offer its explanation, we find it dealing with our wiring very early in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis is this creation story that culminates in day 6, in which God announces, let us make man in our own image. Notice the plurality of that language. Let us make man in our own image. And then it says, so that in our image, in our likeness, they made man and woman. It's this idea that we were created for relationship. We were created in community. That the image of God is discovered, found, manifest in our lives together. That I am not in myself a little image of God walking around, but that the image of God is fulfilled and recognized as I live in community with others. Jump over one chapter later and we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 2, and we begin to see how deeply these relationships work themselves out in our lives as we're formed and created. Humanity is created out of the dust. it bears this understanding of a relationship between us and the earth on which we live. Then we come to find that prior to God's breath breathed in our nostrils, we've got a form of life, but not any real substantial kind of life. And so it bears this responsibility, this relationship that we now have with God. And then as we continue on in this story, God sees that humanity is alone, and that's not good. So he makes all the animals of the planet, and humanity begins to name those animals, and it begins to show that we have this relationship not only with the earth and with God, but we also have this relationship with the creatures that inhabit this land. That when we're commanded to eat of all the seed-bearing plants on this earth, again, it's this understanding that we have this cosmological relationship with everything that is in it. And then God pulls from the side of humanity an etzer, a helper, someone to walk alongside with them, knowing that they are not complete until they have someone to stand shoulder to shoulder and take this journey together. So out of the side of Adam, or the human, God creates Ish, male, and Ishisha, female. And they're created naked, which is this beautiful, symbolic, poetic way of saying they were created for intimacy, for relationship, for vulnerability. That we come to discover early in this story of Israel that our wiring is for connectivity. A connectivity that deals with God, a connectivity that deals with the land, a connectivity that deals with the animals, but a connectivity that deals with one another. And that peace, harmony, is recognized, understood, lived out as we live in these proper relationships with the Creator, with God. And from that relationships flows a right way of being with everything else that surrounds us. And now we need to leap back for a moment to where we left off last week, that fateful moment where we grabbed hold of and seized control of our own destinies, taking a role that we were never intended to fulfill. It's this moment where we now are in charge of our own destinies. And in previous ways of thinking about the story, we think in terms of those moral categories. Now God is good, and because we sinned, we're bad. But let's suspend that for a moment and think in terms of relationships. That we were created to live in this appropriate, proper relationship of dependence and need with God. And now we have cast that off. And in casting that off, a whole lot of stuff enters into the garden that was never supposed to be there in the first place. Like what? Like guilt. Like shame. All of a sudden, after this sin, they begin to recognize that they're naked, that they're vulnerable, and they go and hide, and shame takes control of their lives. And now as God is walking in the garden in the cool of the day and looking for them, he calls out to them, and they living in the shame now felt the guilt of betraying what God had commanded them to do. And now this blame game goes on between Adam saying it was Eve's fault, Eve saying it was the serpent's fault. And you begin to see how deeply disharmonious this relationship become, the conflict, the impending violence that we can begin to see happen in this relationship. And God begins to instruct Adam and Eve and help them understand all of what this cosmic crash has created in their relationships with everything. The serpent, symbolic of the creatures that live around us, now strikes at our heels and we try to crush its head. It throws our relationships with the living beings in this world into disharmony, into conflict. This land from which we were supposed to have this fruitful abundance, you shall eat of all of its yield. Now it produces thorns and thistles, and it's from the sweat of our brow that we have to produce what it is that we eat. This relationship that we're supposed to have with each other, that was supposed to work itself out in vulnerability and intimacy and closeness, is now about a woman's desire for a man so that she can gain her identity through having a child, and it's man's domination over this woman, and it throws everything out of balance, into this tension and into this conflict where we're pitted against one another, and eventually we're tossed out of the garden, this perfect place of right relationships, and the crash that happens in us is so thorough and so deep that we can't even begin to see the possibilities of right relationships. Good, bad, yeah, sure. There's some good and there's some bad, but I want us to think in terms of relationships. So is the story of the fall over there at the end of chapter 3 when we are now east of Eden? I want to say no. Because I think to get the full depths of how deeply this brokenness runs, we've got to leap, we've got to take one more step and jump into the story of two brothers found in Genesis chapter 4. Cain and Abel, these two brothers who present these offerings to God. One is considered acceptable, the other is not. And instead of rejoicing with one another, it creates this conflict, this tension, this competitiveness between them. And Cain takes his brother out into the fields and slays him. God comes looking for Abel and he says, "Where's your brother?" And this one question, which looms heavy over us still today, is asked: am I my brother's keeper? Am I in any way responsible for anything other than myself? Am I the land's keeper? Am I the animal's keeper? Am I my brother's keeper? Am I anybody's keeper other than me and myself? Originally, when we're created, we're wired for relationships. The image of God is recognized as we share and live in community. But by the end of chapter 4 of Genesis, we begin to see how deeply broken and fractured the possibilities of relationships really are. And it's out of that brokenness that words like loneliness, alienation, violence, bitterness, resentment, malice, jealousy, envy, greed begin to emerge. These aren't just moral categories. This is the result of a broken world that no longer lives in right relationship with one another. So when we think in terms of relationships, then we have to ask the question, what does this journey we call Christianity have to do with the restoration of right relationships between us and God, us and the world, and us and one another? If in the end all we can do is think in terms of moral categories of being good rather than bad, then all we do is really, especially as it relates to spirituality and Christianity, is about moral reform. And we tend to live in condemnation or judgment or tend to feel like we're guilty for not having done more to be good. Or we can live in self-righteousness thinking we've done enough to be good. But I'm not sure that's what this journey's all about. I tend to think in terms of relationships. That what God does in the person of Christ Jesus is not so much moral reformation, but it is about reconnecting, maybe even rebooting, drawing us back to the intended creative nature of who we are, this capacity to live well with one another. That forgiveness is not about forgiving a moral bad, but creating a pathway, a way that you and I can live in relationships with one another. And that somehow what is happening in there is reconciliation, restoration, the drawing near of one another, to be able to share in this life of vulnerability and connectivity, where we're no longer alienated and alone, but that we have this deep sense of community, not only with one another, but with God and with the earth around us. And out of that, there's a sense of peace and harmony that begins to take hold of our hearts and lives and surrounds us as an aura of what people in Israel would call shalom, God's peace, His gift to us of proper relationship.